In this very lesson, we want to see how we can use the row operation to find the inverse of a 3 by 3 matrix. Remember, in our previous lesson, we learned how to use the row operation to find the inverse of a 2 by 2 matrix. We are going to apply the same concept here. So looking at this matrix, we can see that it is what a 3 by 3 matrix, and therefore we are going to augment this 3 by 3 matrix by a 3 by 3 unit matrix. Now that we have the augmented matrix for this matrix A, let's call this row 1, let's call this row 2, and then let's call this row 3. Now once we have this, we are going to perform operations on the row until the left hand side of the augmented matrix becomes a unit matrix. Now what is left on the right hand side becomes the inverse of this matrix. So in doing that, we are going to make this entry to be 0, 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 and then all the leading diagonal will be what? 1, 1, 1, as we can see in this aspect. So first of all, we are going to start with this particular entry. Now to make an entry 0, we either add or subtract. And then to make an entry 1, we divide or multiply. Take note of that. So we want to make this entry 0. We are going to perform operations on this particular row so that this entry will be what? 0. So you can see that when we have row 2 minus 2 row 1, this entry is going to be what? 0. So we have row 2, which is 2 minus 2. Row 1 is what? 1. 2 minus 2 gives us what? 0. And we have achieved our LCM. Now I also want this entry to be 0 as well. So you can see that when you perform the operation R3 minus 3 R1, this entry is going to be what? 0. So we have our R3 is 3 minus 3 R1 is what? 1. So we have 3 minus 3, that gives us what? 0. Now remember that these rules affect the whole of entries in row 2. The same thing applies to this particular rule. We are going to apply the same rule on each of the entries in row 3. Kindly take note of that. Remember, the first rule is untouched, so we are going to repeat it. So we have 1. So we have our first operation, R2, which is row 2 minus 2 row 1. So we have this entry is definitely going to give us what? 0. So we have R2 is negative 1, then we have minus, and then we have 2. Row 1 is what? 2. So we have minus 1 minus 4, that gives us what? Minus 5. So this entry is going to be what? Minus 5. We are still on row 2. Now row 2 we have 1, so we have 1 minus 2. Row 1 is what? 2. So we are going to have 1 minus what? 4, that gives us minus 3. So we have this entry to be minus 3. We are still on row 2 using this particular rule. So we have 0 minus 2, row 1 is what? 1. So we have minus 2. So we have minus 2. Then look at what this entry. We have 1 minus 2. R1 is 0. So we have 1 minus 0 to give us what? 1. So we have 1. Then look at this particular entry, which is 0. So we have 0 minus 2, and then what? 0. So this is giving us what? 0. So we are done with what? Row 2. Then move on to row 3. So we are going to apply this rule on each of the entries in row 3. So we have this will give us 0 because it was it that we were able to come out with what? The rule. So definitely it's going to give us 0. Then move on to the next entry, which is minus 2 minus 3. Row 1 is what? Row 1 is 2. We have minus 2 minus 6, that gives us what? Minus 8. So we have minus 8. Then move on to the next entry, which is 3. So we have 3 minus what? 3. Its corresponding row 1 is what? Is 2. So we are having 3 minus what? 6. That gives us minus 3. So let's look at this entry. So we have 0 minus 3 R1. Its corresponding row 1 entry is 1. So we are going to have minus or 3. Then we look at 0 minus 3. Its corresponding row 1 entry is what? 0. And that's going to give us what? 0. Then look at the last entry, which is 1 minus 3. Its corresponding row 1 entry is what? 0. So we are going to have 1. So we are done with what? Row 2 and then what? Row 3. So we are going to look at these two entries. We want these entries to be 0. We want these two to be 0 and then this negative to be 0. So we have to perform operations on row 1 and row 2 so that we can have these two entries to be what? 0. So with row 1, we are going to multiply, let me print this one. We are going to multiply row 1 by 5 and then we add it to 2 row what? 2 row 2. Let me also clean row 3. So we are going to have 5 row 3 and then minus what? 8 row 2. So this is the rule that we are going to use to enable us to get this entry to be 0. So we are having 5 times what? Row 1. Row 1 is what? 2. And then plus 2. Row 2 is what? Minus 5. So we have 10 minus 10. That gives us 0. So it means that this rule will actually work. Let's look at this particular rule. So we have 5. Row 3 is what? Minus 8. And then we have minus 8. Row 2 is what? Minus 5. So we have minus 40. And then what? Plus what? 40. And that gives us what? 0. So it means that this rule will also work. So we are going to start with this. Now remember, row 2 is untouched. So we are going to repeat what? Row 2. So we have 0. So we have 5 row 1 and then plus 2 row 2. Row 2 is 0. So we have 5 plus 0. That gives us what? 5. So we have this entry to be 5. This will give us what? 0. We look at this particular entry. So we have 5 row 2 plus 2. Its corresponding row 2 is what? Minus 3. So we have 10 minus 6. That gives us what? 4. So we have this entry to be what? 4. So let's look at this particular entry. So we have 5. Row 1 is 1. Then we have plus 2. Row 2. Its corresponding row 2 entry. We have minus 2. So we have 5 minus 4. That gives us what? 1. So we have 1. Then we look at this particular entry. We have 5 times row 1 plus 2. Its corresponding row 2 entry is 1. So we have 0 plus 2. That gives us what? 2. Then we have the last entry for row 1. So we have 5 multiplying row 1 plus 2. Its corresponding row 2 entry is 0. So we have what? 0. So we are done with what? Row 1. Let's look at what? Row 3. So we are using this particular rule for what? Row 3. So we have 5. Row 3 is 0 and then minus what? 8. Its corresponding row 2 entry is 0. So we have 0, 0. And then we have, this is definitely going to give us what? 0. Then we look at this particular entry. So we have 5. Row 3 is what? Minus 3. Minus 8. Its corresponding row 2 entry is what? Minus 3. So we have minus 15 plus what? 24, and that gives us what? 9. So you have this entry to be what? 9. Then let's look at this particular entry. So we have 5. Row 3 is what? Minus 3. And then minus 8. 8 corresponding row 2 entry is what? Minus 2. So we have minus 15 plus what? 16, right? It has positive 1. So we have 1. Then we look at the last but 1 entry. So we have 5. Row 3 is 0. Minus what? 8. 8 corresponding row 2 entry is what? 1. So we have minus what? 8. Then we look at what? The last entry for row 3. So we are done with what? Row 3. Right now we want this entry to be 0, this entry to be what? 0. So we can use what? Which rule? So we know that when we multiply row 1 by 9, and then we have minus 4 row 3, we are going to get this entry to be 0. Let's look at it. 9 row 1 is 4 minus 4. R3 is what? 9. This will give us 36 minus 36. That gives us what? 0. So it means that this rule will work. Then let's look at this particular entry. We want this entry to be what? 0 as well. So we are going to multiply row 2 by 9, and then we add it to 3. Row what? 3. So let's look at it to see if this entry is going to be 0. So we have 9 row 2. Row 2 is minus 3. And then we have plus 3 row 3 is what? 9. So this gives us minus 27 plus what? 27. And that gives us what? 0. So it means that this rule will also work. Remember that row 3 is going to be untouched. So we are going to repeat it. So we are going to have, let's start with the first one, row 1. So we have 9. Row 1 is what? 5. So we have 5 minus 4. Its corresponding row 3 entry is what? 0. So we are going to get what? 9, 5, 45. So we have 45 for the first entry. Then we look at this particular entry. So we have 0. We have 9, 0, and then minus 4. Its corresponding row 3 entry is what? 0. So we have 0. So we are going to have 0. Then we look at this particular entry. Definitely is going to give us what? 0. And then we have this particular entry. So we have 9 multiply 1, and then we have minus 4. Its corresponding row 3 entry is what? 9. So it's 1. So we have 9 minus 4. That gives us what? 5. So we have 5. So let's look at row 2. So row 2, definitely this is going to give us 0. And then we have 9 row 2. We are looking at this. So we have minus 5. And then plus 3. Row 3 is what? 0. So we are going to get minus 45. This gives us 0. So we have minus 45. Definitely, this is giving us what? 0. Now, when we apply the rule on the rest of the entry in row 2, we are going to get minus 15, and then what? Positive 15. Now, the next thing that we are going to do is to make sure that the leading diagonals are all 1s. So we are going to have R1 divided by what? 45. And then we want this entry to be 1. So we have R2 divided by minus 45. We want this entry to be 1. So we have R3 divided by what? 9. So we are going to have this is going to give us what? 1. This is going to give us 0. This is going to give us what? 0. Now this is going to give us 1 over what? 9. And then we have 50 divided by what? 45. and that's going to give us 10 over 9. And then we are going to have minus 20 divided by 45, and that's going to give us minus 4 over what? 9. So we have R2 divided by minus 45. This is going to give us what? 0. This is going to give us 1. This is going to give us what? 0. Now we have minus 15 divided by what? Minus 45, and that's going to give us 1 over what? 3. So we have 1 over 3. This is also giving us 1 over 3. This is giving us minus 1 over 3. Now let's look at this. So we have 0, 0, 1. This will give us 1 over 9. This will give us minus 8 over what? 9. And this is giving us what? 5 over 9. So we can observe that on the left-hand side of the augmented matrix, we are having what? A 3 by 3 unit matrix. Once you achieve this, what is left on the right-hand side becomes the inverse of the matrix we are looking for. Therefore, the inverse of A will be given as what? As easy as that. This brings us to the end of today's lesson. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.